Hi all, my name is Ulrich Rysgaard from Color Tokens, and I'm a Zero Trust enthusiast working as a Nordic region executive and cybersecurity advisor here in Color Tokens out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And it's a pleasure here to share some of my understanding of working with the NIST special publication 800-207 about the Zero Trust architecture, and to use that understanding and this framework to demystify Zero Trust a bit and decompose Zero Trust into something more understandable, and also to answer some of those questions that I meet in the market from partners and customers, and for the benefit of having a much easier and stronger adoption of Zero Trust. So let's get started. A few real-life questions. Very initially, why Zero Trust? And I'm asking you, can you provide some good examples? What happens without Zero Trust and what happens with? People is also normally quite confused about what Zero Trust really is, and why there's so many ways of talking about Zero Trust, and so many approaches to that. You know, how can that be? And people is also asking, what is it as a term? Is it a strategy? Is it an architecture? Is it a technology? Or is it design? What is it really when we talk about Zero Trust? And then we'll get back to that. People is also looking for some kind of reference, good definition. Is a standard for Zero Trust, and they continue further with questions like, how can we find the right technology and product that is fit for Zero Trust? How do we evaluate that? You know, how can we choose what is better? And that is, of course, with implementation in mind. And questions continue like, what if I want to implement Zero Trust? Is that even possible, or is it only for the larger few, or does there exist some kind of manageable workflow, solution design, something with all the steps end to end, making this doable? And how doable is it really? Is it only for larger organizations with many resources, or what is the level? What is kind of the size of the organization where would be a good fit? Is kind of a guidance towards that. Is an organization, for example, that's too small, and what is that? And questions like that. Also, like what are the choices to be a little bit more pragmatic and simplify Zero Trust, and without sacrificing too much? We'll look into that. What are the smart choices here? So these are some of the questions that I will address by the understanding from the NIST special publication. So let's look into this. But again, about why Zero Trust, and why do we basically need a much better cybersecurity strategy? And that comes from the fact that most organizations today very naturally come from a place where they're very network centric, very strong parameter, strong firewall, have developed from that, strong network and firewall, adding more security elements, doing assessments, finding weak spots in the infrastructure and the network, trying to make it stronger, adding technology products, mail protection, maybe antivirus, more advanced endpoint protection, EDRs, and so forth, and continuing adding products and trying to assess what is the risk here and what are the weak points, and fixing that and moving on to that. but there's limitations to that approach. We see that clearly. So let's look into some of those limitations. One limitation is, while it's normally very, it's much easier to have a clear view on what is going on out and out and in on the infrastructure and north south, then it's much more difficult to get a clear view of what is happening on the inside on the east-west side. There's clearly limitations to that today in many organizations. Clearly, there's also limitations with endpoint protection technologies. It is clearly not impossible to compromise endpoints anymore. So that kind of leads to the fact that we must assume breach to put ourselves in a better place where we can better try to figure out what to do with that. So if we assume breach, we put ourselves in a better position to say, okay, what are then the next questions that we need to look into? Also, there's clear limitations in preventing launch of code. Even with these more modern attacks, attackers are smart, creative. They're using very legit applications and code, but launched from malicious code. But it can be difficult, and normally for many organizations, there are limitations to prevent that code from running. And that's clearly a problem. Also, this leads to limitations in stopping the movement on the inside, the lateral movement. And if that happens, then other questions are like, how do we prevent them from reaching the very business critical applications if they can move laterally, and find some of those information that is most critical to us? That is not just about ordinary ransomware attacks. We can see attackers is getting smarter. They are doing further reconnaissance towards what is more sensitive information. So today it's not enough to put a name on the wall or destroy or delete, encrypt applications or data. No, they are exfiltrating sensitive information that it makes it quite difficult to recover from such an attack. You cannot restore that with a backup, because if the information is lost, you could be humiliated, lose your trust in the market and your customers, and maybe not be able to continue your business like you did before. So these are the kind of limitations we see, and they all point to what then? We need a better cybersecurity asset. Let's have a look into that. And let's take an example of what we just discussed. How does that look like? What does it look like? And we have a very normal organization, strong network and infrastructure and parameter. And we also have a business critical application out here to the left. We also have users like Alice and Bob and other devices. Have a look at the one out here to the right, and what will happen then. And what will happen eventually for some organizations is that an attacker will have luck compromising an endpoint. And it can be, there can be many different entrances, in multiple locations. It can be a consultant, contractor, external network access. It could be a hybrid on-premise Exchange server with a vulnerability. It could be any application with a vulnerability, or someone clicking a link they shouldn't. And the fact is, the endpoint is compromised eventually. And what will then happen is that they will find a way. Yeah, they're moving laterally and moving on the inside because they're not getting stopped doing that. And what could also happen is that they will launch some further code be able to move further and do further reconnaissance towards what is more important, and eventually then they will find that business critical application and they will take it down. So that was exactly what was not supposed to happen, but that is what is happening, and too much. And that is done despite all this technology that has been developed for many, many years. It's not that we see less attacks. And so that is the nature of what we are talking about and what to do about this. Okay. We'll get to back to this in a moment. So hold the picture and we'll get back to what does this look when we apply zero trust. But back to the fact that there's a lot of confusion about what is zero trust and why there are so many ways of speaking about it and what it really is. And the first part of the clarification here is that zero trust is primarily a principle, never trust, always verify, and is also associated to the fact that you should assume breach. So that is from a high level principle, so you can use to be the anchor of your strategy. And that is exactly how it should be. And the architecture element is how to implement the strategy, and is really your plan to implement that strategy and how to take it further from these very high level, you can say, principles into something that you can implement and execute. The design of that are those detailed choices where the architecture is the further kind of detailed principles and then the framework around it that is not product specific. It can have definitions saying, okay, what is important. The design then is decision about the product, exactly like we have done architecture and implementation by design in many years, and of course then choice of technology. Technology is not zero trust, but technology support the design and architecture implementing the strategy. So it's a technology support for implementing a zero trust architecture, for example. Okay, now back to the example. If we should apply this, what it really means is that from a strategy perspective, let's try to make an example to make us understand how we can work with this as a strategy on a strategic level. Zero trust interpreted saying that what we should really do is move our focus away from assessing risk in the network. In the zero trust model, the network, there's no implicit trust in the network. We don't trust the network just by definition. So instead of doing assessment to try to find out where the weak spots are in the network and the infrastructure, a more direct approach is to have a more direct risk assessment on the critical business applications, what we call the resources. So the point here is that we move our focus away from the network and the infrastructure that we cannot be sure that we can trust, and we make our focus for making risk assessment to the resources, and especially those that is very critical that we need to protect, and say that is our risk, and we base our risk assessment on that. So that is a way of interpreting zero trust from a strategic perspective, and say, okay, let's now move and make a better way of protecting our most critical applications in a way so that they cannot be taken down and stopped, and we cannot lose sensitive data and lose our reputation in the market. So how do we do that? Zero trust architecture is applied and implemented by establishing a microparameter around these resources. Also what we call a trust zone, a zero trust zone. And it's basically a technology mechanism that is also in the framework called the PEP, the Policy Enforcement Point. And this technology mechanism is establishing the principle that there is no inherent trust in the network. There is a default deny access to the resource, meaning that no one has access to this resource until certain conditions has been met. And these would be verified first, and that includes to verify the requester, the subject, like Bob and Alice, but also the assets that they are using and other conditions. And until these has been evaluated and met, then there's no access. When they have been evaluated and verified, then this technology mechanism, the PEP, will enable for access for the session, but only for that session, and will close access again. This way, we break that access that was done before, and we have a much better situation. So that's zero trust in action in a nutshell, but also a very essential element of this is also using a combination of the PEP with microsegmentation to either slow down or block the lateral movement. And we establish microsegmentation as one of the core elements in the architecture to prevent the lateral movement. So that's another core element. And there's more, because then people will say maybe, and that's part of the confusion we were talked about before, yeah, but if I have an identity solution, do I then have a zero trust solution? It's a very essential element to have an identity solution and have a very strong user authentication, maybe multi-factor authentication and so forth, but it's not a complete zero trust architecture as so, and we will see that in a minute how that is defined. No, but it's a very good element, but not a full solution. The same with microsegmentation. It's a very strong element, but it's not a full zero trust architecture solution, and so forth. So that's now the example and the understanding that we're working from. But let's move further into the details of this. So this is our high-level understanding. And by the way, what you should have seen now is that this is quite different from when just having an authentication like an ordinary Microsoft AD authentication of Bob and Alice. From having that authentication done, then you have access to whatever you're authorized to do from that point on. Here, you are evaluating, much further, also the conditions on the resource itself, with further conditions like the condition of, evaluating the trust also on the assets that they are using, and not just the identity and so forth, as we spoke about before. Okay, let's have a further look and say, okay, all that is good, but can we please have some kind of standard around this? Is there a firm definition, a reference or something? Is there a standardized framework about this? And absolutely there is. And I think I would like to point the attention to what we already mentioned in the beginning, that NIST has established this special publication 800-207. I think that has not got the attention that it deserves. It's it's a very written document about how to take zero trust as a strategy and put it into a plan, a zero trust architecture with real steps, and make this real. It's quite new, and maybe that's why it's not gotten the attention that it deserves. It's from August 2020. It has been underway at least since autumn 2019, and it's a leading zero trust architecture reference publication that is used by the US government, and it's something that I can highly recommend looking into. It's even very easy accessible. It's a top hit if you Bing, Google, whatever you prefer, NIST 800-207. It will be a top hit, and then you can just download it for free. As I said, it can be used by non-governmental organizations. There's no copyright to use it, and yeah, it's free and available. Everyone to use it. It's even also very much shorter than many other standardized documents. It's not more than some 50 pages. It's not these 100 of pages with 100 of controls. It's quite simple, and we'll see that in a minute. They would like an attribution, and they certainly deserve that. I will happily support that, especially Scott Rose and the NIST team that we also have been working with. I've had the pleasure working color tokens with a smart group of experts, where we have responded to a request by NIST that was facilitated by Tony Scott, the former federal CIO of the United States under Obama government, and been very helpful to find a way to work with the NIST team and respond to their request to provide input to this publication. And we have been working with this since 2019, and it has been very helpful to understand this in detail and see how this document has evolved. And the same with a special thanks to Chase Cunningham as well, an advisor for color tokens, expert teams, and leadership on zero trust. And yeah, and thank you. So with that said, let's try to see how this works in action and get into more questions. The relevance of this is very high. I just want to take a few examples, provided attention from Tony to this. Again, thank you. There was the OPM breach on the operation of personal management, had a breach, still something that has effects into today. And I think how I understand it is what kind of a starting point from further evidence that a new strategy was needed beyond very strong traditional network-oriented cybersecurity that already existed. And there was part of a high adoption of the zero trust principles, and been working further with that into to other organizations as well. There was also the example with the Snowden incident. The conclusion was the same, that zero trust architecture would have been able to prevent these kind of incidents. And we have seen many other examples of that. We saw it with NotPetya, with AP Møller Mærsk. We have seen very recently, both with SolarWinds and the Hafnium attack vector and so forth, all leading and calling for using new cyber strategy. based on zero trust principles, and could be very more easily at least understood by using the NIST framework. So what does it really say? Now we've been talking about this. We will look into 3 quite easy understood takeaways and conclusions from the document. There is 3 approaches to combine with each its own drivers that we should be aware of, and 7 basic tenets that NIST is calling it that we should be aware of. So that is not a lot to take care of. There is 7 workflow steps to make a full CTA solution implementation, and we will also look into that. And then there are some key definitions, also quite a few, but that is very helpful for us to understand what makes it a strong zero trust architecture implementation, something that we have used to establish a concept of what is a fit for technology, and as we define as the zero trust architecture strength. And let's have a look into this. It's so simple, actually, the document, that you can get everything explained on a very high level for just reading the abstract. I'm very happy with it, with the document. It's very easy to understand. I'll try to convey a very good example. It's also written here from a high level. It's all about moving defenses from static network-based parameters to focus on users, assets, and resources. Okay, so that is one thing. And another thing that is highlighted here that explains a lot is that zero trust assumes that there's no implicit trust in asset user accounts solely based on their network location or physical location. That's why we say there's no implicit trust in the network. And also the fact that authentication authorization should be done on both subject, the user, for example, and the device, and that this technology mechanism, the function, must be performed, to evaluate if it can be trusted, must be performed before a session is established. So this mechanism granting access must evaluate the subject and the device before access is getting granted. And we can go on, and I think just one more thing to highlight here is that zero trust is about moving the focus towards protecting resources. That's a key thing, not network segments. Okay, so that's why we said, circling back to the beginning, we all like to say we do risk-based, we do take a risk-based approach to security, but we really need to rethink what we need, think about what is a risk-based approach. And this become, as we said, very indirect to look at what is the risk of the network if we really don't use the network as our primary security posture anymore, but move the focus, as said here by NIST, to the resource. So that is why we also change our focus when we do risk assessment to the resource. I hope this makes sense. Good. So let's have a look at the 3 approaches and the 7 key tenets, basic tenets. As said here in the publication section 3.1, it's also a small paragraph, a full zero trust solution. So we have a term called the full zero trust solution, will include elements of all 3 approaches. And it actually explains a lot. It explains a lot about why there's so much confusion about what zero trust is, why someone is saying this is zero trust and someone else says something else is zero trust. Have a look at this. Here we have an approach that says that we can do zero trust architecture using enhanced identity governance. Identity as the main driver of policies, where the focus is on the requester, but that we also call the subject, and that we are evaluating very much the trust and integrity of the requester here. So here, a very good example, it could be something else, but a very good example is, for example, a very common used example is the use of a Microsoft Active Directory as a strong identity-based approach, combined with multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and so forth. And it'd be good to be able to integrate with that. So that is one approach that we will take. We will also take the approach to use zero trust architecture using what we call an identity-based microsegmentation approach, where that is the driver of policies, where the focus now is on the resource that we need to protect, moving it from the requester to the resource. And here, granularity of these policies is of high importance. Okay. And then the third approach that we will also do and have a look into is using zero trust based on what we also call software-defined parameters or encrypted access channels, where the focus here is on the encryption part of having an encrypted channel, and can do that in combination. So maybe I hope that will ring a bell, that maybe you, when we have this discussion and there's many approaches to this, it will probably fall into the categories that we see here. And the conclusion of NIST to understand this is what we really must do is to include elements of all three approaches, because they all do their part, from having the strong focus on the subject to the strong focus on the resource, and also the strong focus on the encrypted channel, especially important when we do remote access. So it all makes sense when we combine these. So let's do that. So then after the three approaches that we will combine, NIST have the 7 basic tenets, and that will combine the zero trust architecture and principles. It's quite common sense. It's something that we have already covered. It's just put here very clearly by NIST, and it's taken as a quote here from the document, as you would see it in section 2.1. It's very easy to pick up. Here it's about the focus on the resources. All data sources and computing services are considered resources. Also, network location alone does not imply trust. All communication must be secured regardless of the network location. That meaning, just because we are, if we are inside the network, doesn't mean that we automatically provide access to anyone. It doesn't matter in this situation, meaning that we can defend ourselves equally good, whether we are on the outside or on the inside in the DMZ or wherever we are. It also says, as we said before, trust in the requester, the accessor, must be evaluated before the access is granted. That is a basic tenet, is a core principle, here sub-principle. And access should also be granted with least privilege. How do we do that? Let's have a look into that as well. And it also states very clearly, access should be granted on a per session basis. Okay, 4 to go. Access to these resources should be determined by dynamic policy. What does that mean? It means that there should be a policy that includes what we call the observable state, the state of the client identity, the application service, and the requesting asset, for example, the device that the subject is using for its request towards a resource. Yes. And this policy is a set of what we call access rules that again has attributes that forms these conditions, saying, you know, this is a condition and this is a condition and this is condition that forms this set of access rules. Combined, it becomes a policy for the access to the resource. Okay, and this can be assigned to both the data asset, the application, but also the subject. And let's have a look into this as well, how we do this. Free to go. Something that is very important and could be overlooked is that the enterprise must monitor and measure the integrity and the security posture continuously of all owned and associated assets. That's very important. How do we do that? Because no asset is inherently trusted. So we must evaluate the security posture of these assets when we are evaluating and taking the decision if we should have access to the resource that is being requested. And then another one I very much like is, now that we have these policies as our foundation for access to the resources, but also maybe the asset of the subject, then there is some assumptions that this should work. One of the assumptions is that we would have identity, credential, and access management systems in place. And this includes the use of multi-factor authentication, because as someone asked and said, okay, all this is good, but what if the identity is stolen? Then you can just use the policy and so forth. So that's why it's so important that multi-factor authentication and conditional access is applied into this as one of the things that you cannot do without. You need to do all 7 here, and also now all 6. And multi-factor authentication needs to be one of them, so you cannot easily steal one of the identities and use it for access to the policies. Okay, it makes sense. So it's just to highlight this. And finally, there is this continuous assessment of the current state, the network infrastructure and the communication, to always try to improve its security posture. What does that mean? Improving the security posture. In this context, it will, that means that you would look at the policies, if you can refine them and do it more granularly, make sure that, you know, all 7 tenets is respected, and that you have optimized all 7 here towards what you have observed in your infrastructure. Okay, then what? And say, all this is good and we can do that. What will then be the right technology to do this and help us with that? And there has been also some, I think, there's many statements and saying, yeah, but no single product will implement all this. And while that is probably true, there's also something that is a common misunderstanding about this, because it is possible to make a full zero trust architecture solution. But let's get back to that in a moment, and let's just see what is our method of evaluating product fit and technology for zero trust. To do that, we have very good help in the publication in section 2.0, because here it says very simply and not too wordy, what is the operative definition of zero trust and the zero trust architecture, and that is defined right here, and it also defines what is the crux of the issue here, and that is to prevent unauthorized access, but coupled with making access control enforcement as granular as possible. And let's look at the implications of that. It says that further in the publication. It details this into 2 key points that can help us a lot when evaluating technology. So one thing is to prevent unauthorized access to resources, and we should couple that with making access control enforcement as granular as possible. One of these is to look at the access policies and look at the granularity. Another thing that is written here in this section is that we must shrink these trust zones, the microparameters around the resources, by moving the PEP, whatever that means, and we will have a look at that in a moment, the policy enforcement point closer to the resource. Okay, these 2 things that we'll try to remember these. I'll get back to you and try to ask if you can still remember this. So what are the implications of that? We use these definitions to establish the concept of how strong a zero trust solution implementation is. And we define that as the zero trust architecture strength. Let's have a look. Granularity and moving the PEP closer to the resource to shrink the trust zones. To understand this, let's look at the architectural component that NIST put out here to us. So we're using this figure here in the section, and here it explains all the elements that you would know. Here we see all the input we will get from the system that we put into, feed into the policy decision point and the policy engine trust algorithm. All this is here. What we have below the policy decision point is the policy enforcement point. So this is what the NIST mentioned before, and the trust zone will, by definition, be from the resource and stretch out to the policy enforcement point. And this is important because now it matters. Now we can understand why this is written in the document, why we need to put the policy enforcement point closer to the resource we need to protect. It matters how far away it is, because if this is very far away, maybe in the network, then this zone that we trust will be expanded, and it will, have a larger scope at more risk. So that is one element. So just to summarize, so what we have here is the 3 core elements besides the policy enforcement point and the decision point. The 3 core elements is then now here the subject that is requesting access, including the device asset that the subject is using for the requests. Then we have the resource that can be both the business application and its data. And we have the host system that it's where it's belongs to. And we have the green here circle that becomes the microparameter or the trust zone. And here we have it all. So when we understand these, we have the policies now, we have talked about that. We have the attributes that is belonging to the the set of access rules and the policy. We have the policy decision point up here that holds a trust algorithm, that is the algorithm to make the decision. And we have the policy enforcement point, that is the technology mechanism that open up the access and close it again. And we have the resource, we have the subject, and we have all the inputs that is feed into this, all the information that we rely on to taking the best possible decision for the algorithm. That's it. That's all the components that we have. So it's not that too much, I think. But let's again have a look at the implications on how you can evaluate technology then. That's where we came from. And this becomes very interesting because maybe you don't think of this from the very beginning, just just thinking about what it means to decrease the distance to the policy enforcement point and the resource. And here on the y-axis, we have the granularity. So the higher and better granularity. On the x-axis here, we need to have a low distance to make it better. And that also means that we start out here with a high distance. That would be a big trust zone that becomes too big and is a risk. And that's why we have the lowest CTA strength. That is our concept here of how strong the implementation can be. And that is probably what you would see with these kind of first generation of firewalls and gateways that was placed very much, very far away from the resource that needed to protect, maybe somewhere out in the edge. And it also used policies that was not very granular, probably using network information on OC layer 1 to 3, like network and port protocol information. Then there was an enhancement, and that introduced what someone would call the next generation firewall, that was introducing also the layer 7 firewall that was able to make policies that was much more granular, that could use most, if not all, information in a network packet up to OC layer 7. That includes the application layer and application information and so forth. So that makes the policies much more granular. And it was also possible to put this gateway multiple places, strategic places in the infrastructure, much closer to the resource it needs to protect. And hence we move up here in strength, which was a very good thing. But now thinking about it and say, okay, how can we shrink these zones, the zero trust zones, and move even closer to the resource, and also make policies much more granular? This is where we were rethinking this. And if you rethink this from the ground up and have no legacy in any thing you need to take from the past, then what you wanted to do is to install the PEP on the resource it needs to protect, so that you're shrinking that zero trust zone dramatically, so it does not expand onto the network. It makes it very small. So the distance is really decreased, and hence we move up in strength. And also in this approach, we can take all information that is not being dependent on information in a network packet. We can use all information now in that exists on the agents that is installed on resources and on all other assets in the infrastructure, and make the policies much more granular. So that is also a route to take, and you can then move further up if you can find a way to use further information. What you can do is you can use tricks like install your software in the operating system kernel space to make it even closer, the PE mechanism even closer to the resource it needs to protect, closing that gap further. But more importantly, you could also look into make policies even on a process level of the operating system, and just not ordinary data that exists, and make the policies much more granular if you can control it in a manageable way. So that's the story about how you can use these definitions to evaluate what technology is a good fit for making a strong implementation. But there's also other aspects. So let's have a look at that as well. One thing, though, is that I wanted to just make a remark on and what this means, that what we just talked about. This is a concept of making a dual enforcement point. That was something that was originally articulated by one of our good experts, Sunil Muldiras, that found a way in our working group, together with some of our colleagues, to say, okay, this is a much smarter approach to both install the policy enforcement point on the resource itself, but also being able to install the PEP on the device asset on the requester, and having dual enforcement points, so you can also enforce policies and block traffic directly on the requester, instead of waiting only to block the access here on the resource. So that is really a way to find a solution, a technology solution, to both control the requester, the requesting asset, and the resource. Okay. Now, looking further to this. Now we have looked into the main elements of this. We have not yet looked into the workflow. What if I want to implement this? How will I do that? Is there anything that can support me in what is the workflow? How do I make a design? What are all the steps end to end? Is it even manageable to do this? So yes and no. Let's have a look at that. So this also explains the workflow in 7 steps. If you can pay attention here to the header, then there is we have interpreted this into optimized this into 6 steps. That's not important. We have collapsed some of the first steps. The first step is to, and it's probably quite natural to do that, is to visualize all assets, and also identify the highly business critical resources that is also known as the crown jewels. So that is really the first step, to understand our pool of assets, and especially to have a look at the business critical systems, because that is our focus to do the risk assessment, not the network and the weaknesses in the network and the infrastructure. Step 2 is then to look at one crown jewel at the time, one business critical system at the time, and then visualize and map out all the related access and interactions with that crown jewel, because that is used as our baseline to understand what is the known good required access to this system that needs to happen to not have business interruptions and serve its purpose. So that is done. When that is done, what we would normally find, and that is what we find when we do these implementations, is you would maybe not find any malicious traffic, but you would find very wide access, more than required, more than on a need to be basis. So what you would do is, you would do a semi-manual review of that baseline access and say, okay, so much access is not necessary, this is not needed, and you will review and approve what would be then the limited scope of required and acceptable access. So that is our step 3. Step 4 then is to both implement the required integrations. And this is a very important step, because this is back to, I think there's 2 things people are saying too much when they talk about this, and saying, oh, there's no way to use one technology or platform to implement zero trust. And you should, and it's very complicated, and you should plan with a lot of time to do this. And it seems like that has been very popular to overcomplicate and talk about how difficult zero trust architecture is to implement. And I would like to say that is not how I find it and how we understand it. First of all, you can establish a platform if you take the approach to make very good integrations with preferred technologies that other companies uses. So for example, that taking the example from before, where for example, many organizations use Microsoft Active Directory. If they are using Microsoft 365, they would be in a Microsoft Azure Active Directory adoption situation, and also maybe in a cloud-based multi-factor authentication. So if you can integrate with that, then you have a very strong foundation to meet the first approach that we looked into as one of the 3 approaches that you need to combine. And then you can move on and say, okay, and then if your platform, then you can do the microsegmentation part and have the focus not on the requester that you are doing with your integrations, and you can do the microsegment part and so forth. And you can also evaluate the requester's asset with another technology, and you can find a way to bind these things together with no gaps. Then what you really have is you can find yourself having a full zero trust architecture solution according to NIST, based on a single platform, being able to make the right integrations in a way that you have no gaps in your design. So that's why we have a strong focus on having a very open architecture, allowing for the integrations of the preferred technologies that organizations uses today. Same time here, back to step 4, that we convert this into dynamic policies. That is what NIST calls the policies that are dynamic in nature, meaning that it's not based on static IP addresses and all the hassle you go through, for example, known from traditional network centric microsegmentation, where you might use access control list, VLAN configuration, static IP configurations, and VRF in a rooted distribution core layer, and so forth. Now, here you base it on dynamic policies that are dynamic in nature, that can absorb logic, and you can place workloads into categories with these labels and so forth. They can move around, so they are not tied to these static network elements. So that's important to make it both manageable and also safe. You don't make them so they will still work if they are put in other logical places in your infrastructure. So that's really step 4. And here we do both policies for the resources and the subjects. And it could also include to do the encrypted channel. You could also use, you can have platforms, at least I know one, that can also do encryption and encrypted channels in the same platform. That's absolutely not impossible to do that. And it can also solve the problem of having an encrypted channel for remote access. So now we have 3 approaches combined, and we're really good to go here into step 5. And here this says we should be a quite high emphasis on doing one crown jewel at the time, and make sure to make validation that it verifies that you do not make interruptions in your operations. So make sure that you can simulate your policies before that you enforce them. And for that, it's a very critical element. When I talk to customers about the implementations, the biggest obstacle, at least in the perception when we talk about this, is there is high concern there that they would not like to do the zero trust architecture implementations if it can risk breaking any of the existing operations. And having a thought that we have made all these policies and everything is very strict, and putting that into action, there is this kind of response, that holding your breath and say, okay, does it still work? Will there be all the required access, or will there be kind of a huge implications with that? So that's why it's so important to have a simulation element and verification element, making sure there's no business interruptions when you apply this, and it works as you want, as desired. And then we are really here in the end of this. We are in steady operational state, and what is important here is to do continuous monitoring in an effective way, as said by NIST, to be able to improve your policies and your posture, and refine it, and improve it all the time. And also to effective change management, because this only works if you can adopt changes and make it work practically. Yes. So why has it become popular to say that it is so complicated and we should take a lot of time to implement this? If you focus your technology support, and if you look for technology support that can really automate these 6-7 steps, then it doesn't need to be a very complicated things. And that is some of the things that you would be able to see in other demos that we have done, how easy it could be. But the first step of making this not too complicated and easy is really to understand what the zero trust architecture is, the 3 approaches, the 7 basic tenets, the 6-7 steps, depending on if you collapse the steps in the beginning, and find a tool that can partially automate these steps. Yes, that's how it is. So now we're back to the question: is this only for big organizations, or how does this scale? And this scales beautifully in the right direction, and for me that direction is downwards. This scales beautifully to very small organization. I have been participating in implementations with organizations down to 10 servers and 50 users, and it's no bigger burden for a small organization to implement this than a bigger organization. Not at all, actually, and no burden at all. It just makes it easier to have an overview of this. The process is the same, yeah, it's absolutely doable. So there's, to my opinion and my understanding and what we have tried, no difference with this. Of course, you can say that there could be like a higher limit if there's a very large organization with a very highly complex application environment. It takes either more automation and it also takes more verification to make sure that the application logic and the access is mapped out correctly to convert it into policies. But again, you can do smart choices, and this is here the end of the series of questions that we can answer in this session based on understanding the NIST special publication. And this is really to understand that it's not about starting to do the smart choice here, in my opinion. It's not just to start doing, for example, first doing an identity solution, and then after that you would do micro-segmentation across all things, because it becomes, that's kind of a horizontal way to make to cut it, if you can say so. But what you really want is to cut it the other way, vertically, and say start, as Nis said, with one business critical application, one crown jewel, and there's actually no excuse for not reducing the most important risk you have in your organization, and that is back to that most critical business application that you have. Reduce that risk on that first, and then do vertically apply the seven basic tenets and the 3 approaches all the way through on that alone. And of course, everything that is associated with that and have impact with that. And you can do that, and then you can move on to the other one, the next business critical application, and so forth. So that is our understanding, and my understanding, a very smart choice. Without sacrificing too much, you can be very pragmatic, and this way you also take a more direct, true risk-based approach, focusing on your risk on where it matters most, and that is your most business critical application. And I don't think there would be any easier way to more effectively reduce risk, because if you did something else, and most security improvements can be quite complex just to roll out in a complete organization, at once, and do everything at once, all over the place. But here you can start in a corner where it matters most. So that's really the conclusion for this session here. A final remark is that it's a very good idea and a strong suggestion to work with this. Take these approaches, the tenants, the integrations, and put it all into a blueprint. That is what we are doing when we do this. That's also why we say that it's our firm understanding that this is not like climbing a mountain or anything like this. This could be much easier than like running downhill if you just have a good blueprint and you have a design blueprint that you can reuse over and again, and you put all this into the steps and you verify that you have done them, and you know how you automate each of the steps and so forth. And yeah, then it's absolutely doable and can be done and repeated many times, as we are doing with our partners and customers on a daily basis. Yes. So with that, I would like to round up, to complete this session. And I just have a few examples of, why you maybe would not like to use traditional network-based approach, because there's a lot of configuration to handle, and maybe that is something that would be not scaling. You would look to Gartner. They have made very good articles about scale for identity-based microsegmentation, the second approach with a focus on the resources and how that is can be done, for example, agent-based, that is with much simpler policy templates, and how that is quite different from using traditional network protocols. Also, if you should evaluate the requester's asset, the device that the requester is using, you would maybe be thinking towards 802.1x, the protocol used for network access control. It can be done. Also been doing that myself in the past, knowing that you can do very good implementations, but I would never say that it'd be very easy. It's actually quite comprehensive to do that. I would absolutely not recommend taking that route. It's a very long route, and you should have a lot of more resources than doing these more automated modern approaches using a cloud-based approach, automation tool that is much simpler in also its policy making, where you should probably look for a tool that can do what we call application-aware policy templates. Having a policy that is dynamic and also can be identity-based, integrating with your Active Directory or other identity solution can be key to make this easy. Being able to reuse all the group information that you have done in your AD is a huge automation step, and takes a lot of effort out of your zero trust architecture implementation. There's a lot of definition you have already done, you can reuse. Is it the only attribute that you would be using? No, but it's one of the critical ones that you want to apply and to enhance and improve the granularity of your policies. And it takes a lot of energy and task out of your implementation. So that is something that you would also look into doing. Another final remark is that you probably also would like to use for something that is visually more easy to comprehend as a human when you are reviewing your policies. Step number 3, when you want to review and understand your access baseline for a particular crown jewel, how it's mapped out, and review that before converting it into policies, really helps to make that visual. So you would probably look to something that can do visualize in application, business application understanding, that understand business applications, and also use policies that can be used as a template and reused again with that kind of a logic, make it easy to reuse, and also policies that is application aware and understand application language. For example, like if it's a 1-tier, 2-tier, or 3-tier application, that it understands that it can have a front end and for example, a database associated to it, and so forth. Something like that. That is something that is truly helpful. But it's of course up to you. And I wish you the best of luck with your zero trust architecture implementation. It doesn't need to be so complicated. It's really just about following these 6-7 steps, having a good automation, good tooling, good integration, and then also make sure on your checklist that you have implemented the 3 approaches. Focus on the requester and the identity as the driver. Second approach, focus on the resource, the application system and its data, and with a microsegmentation mechanism based on application awareness and identity. The importance here is you can do it per application. That is the clue here for making that micro parameter with high granularity as you want it. and then the encrypted channel can be, you don't need, that's another smart choice. You don't need to encrypt everything, but maybe some of for some of the crown jewels, you would say, okay, this is more important, and you can encrypt that. You don't need the burden of encrypting everything, but you can do it by an active choice where it suits you best. Yes, so that was a short summary. I hope you found it interesting. I really hope that you would have a look at NIST special publication 800-207. It really deserves it. It's, I think they did a very good job writing this, and it's put out here for good use, making it easier to make stronger adoption of zero trust, and also much easier following these steps. It's no excuse. It's only a couple of 50 pages. Yeah, good luck with it. And I look forward to hear from you. If anyone would like to have a good discussion, exchange opinions or experiences, I'm very easy to find and reach. You can also just scan the QR code here. It has my contact information embedded, and feel free to reach out here to us at Color Tokens. We like to share experience about zero trust architecture and real implementations. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. All right.
All right.
You made it. Great. So Neil, I'll defer to you for any comments or concerns first.
No, I think I have nothing to add, actually. I think it kept me focused and engaged. There was no repetition of data or information. You weren't going in loops. It was a very straight path and easy to follow. I think it was good.
I agree. I don't have any things that I'm already editing it while we're watching it, but it's very simple just to get it all streamlined, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we were at how much did we clock on the recording? An hour and 10 minutes or something like that?
Give or take. I'm recording this on Zoom, so unfortunately I can't see the. It doesn't have a readout, but ballpark. Yeah, I agree, and I would think that probably be pretty close to that. Maybe take off about 5 minutes after you just streamlining it, but I don't even know if that, because that was a good clip.
Very good. Yep. I think we can get
maybe,
a lot
by the way, while we're talking about this, could we maybe stop recording? It's making it more relaxed, maybe.
Stop recording?
Yeah, can we do that?
Sure.